This is the recording they never wanted released. My name is Ranger Daniel Mercer. I was born in Elkins, West Virginia, and I spent most of my career stationed in the mountains that raised me. For years, I believed I knew these ridges like the back of my hand. The trails, the hidden streams, the sounds of every bird and every shifting branch. But in the summer of 1998, when I was assigned to Lookout Tower number 9 in the Monongahela National Forest, I learned just how little I really understood. The tower stood alone on a narrow ridge, a 40-foot structure of steel and timber, weather-beaten and creaking with every gust of wind. My job was simple: watch for smoke by day, listen for trouble by night. People assume the job is lonely, and it is. Days blend together. The radio chatter is sparse, and your only company is the endless sweep of trees in every direction. But for me, that solitude was the draw. I thought I'd find peace there. I thought the forest was unchanging, dependable. I was wrong. I remember the first night it happened. The air was still, too still. No wind, no crickets, not even the faint trill of owls. I leaned against the railing of the tower and scanned the ridges through binoculars, the same ridges I had looked at 1,000 times before. That's when I noticed it. The line of trees across the valley didn't sway. They didn't bend. They shifted, as if the entire hillside inhaled. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and for a moment thought fatigue was getting the better of me. But then it happened again. The whole forest seemed to rise and settle like it was breathing. At first, I told myself it was a trick of the light. Maybe the fog was rolling through in a way that distorted my vision. But then came the sound. It was low at first, like a groan echoing up from beneath the soil. Not thunder, not wind. It was the sound of something alive. And when it moved again, the trees didn't just sway. They bent. All at once, in unison, as if the ground beneath them was shifting with something massive, something buried just beneath the surface. I grabbed the radio, tried to call it in, but the channel was nothing but static. Then, 3 knocks. Clear, hollow, like someone tapping the base of the tower. I froze, because I knew no one was supposed to be there. That trail hadn't seen a hiker in weeks. And yet, someone, or something, was letting me know I wasn't alone. They told me later that I was imagining it, that I must have been overtired. But tell me, what kind of exhaustion leaves behind tracks? Because when I climbed down from the tower the next morning, there were prints in the soil around the base. Not boot prints, not animal tracks. They were long, wide impressions, as though something with no shape and no form had That was just the beginning. The forest out there doesn't just surround you. It watches you. It waits. Some rangers won't talk about it. Some don't even admit it exists. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And when I tell you that the forest itself moved, I mean it. It shifted like a living thing, like something old and hidden had finally stirred awake. If you're still listening, don't make the mistake of thinking this is a story. It isn't. It's a record, a warning, one that was never supposed to leave Tower 9. And if you want the truth, the real truth about what lives in those hills, you'll want to hear everything. Because what happened that night didn't end at the tower. It followed me. And once you hear it, it will follow you too. This is MindFuel. Subscribe, because the story you're about to hear is only the first piece of a larger truth. And if you think you can walk away once it begins, you're wrong. My name is Ranger Daniel Mercer. By the summer of 1998, I had already been with the Forest Service for 5 years. I wasn't new to the work, but when they told me I'd be sent to Lookout Tower number 9 for a 6-week assignment, I felt like I was stepping into something I wasn't fully prepared for. It was my first season stationed in a tower that deep, miles from the nearest road, miles from anyone who could hear you if you called out for help. To get there, I had to hike 7 miles with all my gear, food rations, a sleeping bag, a field journal, and the radio that was supposed to keep me in contact with headquarters. The climb was brutal, and by the time I reached the tower, the sun was already setting. From the base of the ridge, the tower rose above the tree line like a skeleton, 40 feet of steel and wood bolted together, swaying slightly in the mountain wind. At the top was the cabin, 4 walls of glass so I could see in every direction. Endless forest, nothing else. They told me this was the quiet post, that Tower 9 had the lowest fire incidents, that the assignment was as close to a vacation as a ranger could get. But when I stopped in town before the hike, the locals didn't seem to agree. At the diner, an older man leaned across the counter when he heard where I was headed. He lowered his voice and said, "You don't want that tower, son. Not 9. Folks up there hear the woods move." I laughed it off, but he didn't. He just shook his head, slid my coffee across the counter, and said no more. The first few days were uneventful. I'd wake with the sun, scan the ridges with binoculars, and log what I saw. The forest stretched out, like a green ocean, rolling hills of oak, maple, and pine, unbroken as far as the eye could see. By day, it was beautiful, calm, but by night, the silence was different. It wasn't just quiet, it was too still. No crickets, no frogs by the creek below, no owls calling from the trees. It felt as though the woods were holding their breath, listening. I would sit in the glass cabin, lantern lit, journal open, waiting for something, anything, to break the silence. The wind would push against the tower, the frame groaning like old bones. Sometimes, I swore I felt it shift beneath my feet, even though the ground was steady. I told myself it was just the structure, just the age of the beams. But deep down, something in me knew better. By the end of the first week, that's when I remembered what the man in the diner had said. Folks up there hear the woods move. At the time, I thought he meant it as some kind of old mountain saying, maybe a warning against fatigue, or a way to spook outsiders. But standing in that tower, night after night, I realized it wasn't just talk. Something was different about those hills. Something was shifting out there in ways I couldn't explain. The first sign came at midnight, just over a week into my shift. I was lying in the cot, staring at the ceiling, when I realized I couldn't hear the wind anymore. Not through the cracks in the window, not in the trees below. The silence was complete, suffocating. And then I noticed what was missing. The smell. You can always smell pine, damp soil, the faint rot of leaves. But that night, the air was blank, hollow. It was as if the forest wasn't just quiet. It was gone. And in its place was something else. A presence that didn't belong to the woods, but moved within them all the same. I got up, pressed my face to the glass, and stared into the darkness. No movement, no sound, just a wall of trees standing motionless against the night sky. And yet, every hair on my body stood on end. as if something out there was watching me, waiting. I should have written it down in the journal. I should have logged the silence, the unease. But I didn't, because some part of me already knew. What I was experiencing wasn't meant to be recorded. It was meant to be survived. They told me this was the easy post, the quiet assignment. But in Tower 9, I began to understand that quiet doesn't always mean safe. Sometimes, quiet means the forest is holding its breath because something else has entered it. By the second week, the silence at night was no longer something I noticed. It was something I dreaded. Every dusk, I would brace myself for the stillness, that heavy pressure that seemed to settle over the tower as the last light left the ridges. But nothing compared to the night I first heard the footsteps. It was close to midnight. I was half asleep on the cot, lantern burning low, when the sound came. At first, I thought it was the creak of the tower shifting against the wind. But then, I heard it again. A weight pressing down, wood groaning beneath it. A steady rhythm, deliberate and slow. Boots on the stairs. Someone was climbing the tower. My first thought was a fellow ranger. Maybe someone had hiked up in the night, though I couldn't imagine why. The trail was brutal even in daylight, and there had been no warning, no radio call, no light approaching through the trees. Whoever it was, they hadn't announced themselves, and that alone chilled me. The steps climbed higher. 7, 8, 9. I counted them without meaning to, each one echoing through the frame of the tower, rattling the metal bolts. By the time they reached the landing just beneath the cabin, I was sitting upright, heart pounding. The door rattled softly on its hinges, as if someone was standing just outside, waiting. I swallowed hard, grabbed the flashlight from the table, and forced myself to move. My hand hovered over the knob. Every instinct screamed at me not to open it, but I had to know. I had to see who had climbed that far into the mountains in the dead of night. I yanked the door open. The lantern light spilled onto the landing. The stairs stretched down into darkness, and there was no one there. The silence that followed was worse than the footsteps. I leaned out, flashlight beam cutting through the night, but the stairs were empty. No movement, no voice, just the endless stillness of the forest. And then I saw them. Footprints. Clear, wet, heavy prints tracked across the landing boards. Mud, smeared and dripping as if from boots that had walked through the creek below. They led all the way up the steps, but there were none going down. I crouched, tracing the line with the flashlight, following them back toward the door of the cabin. They stopped just at the threshold, as if whoever had left them had stepped up to the door and vanished. I stood there for what felt like hours, light trembling in my hand, until finally I forced myself back inside. I shut the door, locked it, and sat against the wall with the radio in my lap. My throat was dry, my hands shaking. I didn't know what I was waiting for. Maybe for the footsteps to start again. Maybe for a knock. Instead, I froze, staring at the speaker, waiting for more. And then it came again. "Stay inside. Don't answer the door." The voice was familiar, but I couldn't place it. It wasn't any ranger I knew. I grabbed the mic, thumb hovering over the button to respond, but then I stopped, because the channel wasn't active. I checked twice. No tower was scheduled to be on that frequency at that hour. The voice shouldn't have been there at all. For the rest of the night, I didn't move. I sat with my back against the door, flashlight pointed at the stairs. radio in my lap, waiting for either the prince to reappear or the voice to return. Neither did. Only the silence remained. But from that night forward, I realized something had changed. The stillness of the woods was no longer just heavy. It was aware, watching. And whatever had climbed my stairs, it hadn't left. The night of the footsteps left me shaken, but in the daylight I tried to convince myself it had been exhaustion. Maybe I had been dreaming. Maybe the prints were my own, tracked unknowingly. But then the tree line began to change. It started small, almost unnoticeable. I would lean against the glass, binoculars in hand, scanning the ridges the way I did every morning. The trees stretched for miles, green and endless, fading into mist. But one morning, when I compared what I saw to the notes in my log, something didn't line up. The tree line to the north, dense oak and pine, looked closer. Only by a few feet, maybe less, but closer. At first, I blamed my eyes. Perspective plays tricks on you when you're staring at the same ridges day after day. But the feeling stayed with me. The next morning, I checked again. Same ridge, same cluster of trees. Only now it seemed closer still. I frowned, raised the binoculars, and marked the spot with a rock on the sill. When I lowered them and looked with the naked eye, I swore the distance had shrunk, as if the trees had crept forward while I wasn't watching. By the third morning, I decided to test myself. I took out the disposable camera we were issued for documenting fires and snapped a photo of the ridge. I tucked it into my log and went about the day. The following morning, I returned to the exact same spot, framed the exact same view, and took another. When I compared them side by side, my stomach turned cold. The tree line in the second photo was closer. Not by much, just a few feet, but enough that the difference was clear. Enough that it couldn't be ignored. That night, with lantern light spilling across the journal, I wrote something I never thought I'd put in an official log. The forest is moving. I stared at the words for a long time, pen trembling in my hand. It felt wrong to write them, like I was putting something into existence that shouldn't be acknowledged. But the evidence was there. It was real. The next morning, I made the call. I radioed in, told my supervisor what I had seen, careful to stick to the facts. No mention of footsteps on the stairs, no voice through dead frequencies, just the tree line, just the photographs. There was a long silence on the other end, broken only by the faint hiss of static. Then his voice came through, flat and dismissive. "It's fatigue, Mercer. Happens to everyone up there sooner or later. You're staring at trees too long. They'll play tricks on you." I tried to protest, told him I had the photos, the log entries. He cut me off. "Get some rest. Rotate your shifts. Don't let your mind wander." And just like that, feet at a time, then yards, always advancing, always inching toward the tower. Never in motion when I watched, but always nearer when I looked away. The forest was not still. It was alive, and it was closing in. By the end of the second week, I stopped comparing the photos. I couldn't stand to see the proof stacking up in front of me. I shoved them into the logbook, closed it tight, and shoved it into the drawer. But no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the truth lingered every time I looked out through the glass. The tree line was moving, and no one would believe me. The tower had always been my refuge, my vantage point above the wild. But as the trees drew closer, as the distance shrank inch by inch, I realized the tower wasn't protecting me. It was isolating me, leaving me stranded, alone, as the force crept closer in ways no man could explain. By the third week, the moving tree line wasn't the only thing gnawing at me. Nights had grown heavier, the silence so absolute that it pressed against the glass of the tower. I would sit with my lantern dimmed, staring out into the dark valleys below, trying to convince myself nothing had changed. But then came the lights. The first night, I thought they were fireflies. A scatter of faint glimmers deep in the trees, flickering just above the ground. But fireflies move in swarms, scattered and playful. These lights moved in lines, deliberate. Lanterns, carried by hands I couldn't see. One here, another 100 yards off, weaving slowly between the trunks. Too steady to be fire, too controlled to be chance. I froze at the glass, binoculars shaking in my hands as I focused the lens. That's when I saw them. Figures. Tall, narrow shapes, their outlines half hidden in the mist between the trees. They weren't walking like hikers. Their movements were too measured, too in sync. One would pause, then another, lanterns swinging slightly, but their rhythm matched, as if they were tied together somehow, moving to the same unheard command. I couldn't see faces, couldn't make out details, just the faint glow of the light and the suggestion of bodies passing through the dark. I felt my stomach twist. There weren't supposed to be people out there. That section of the forest hadn't been open to the public in years. Too remote, too dangerous. No trails led that far, no campsites, no reason for anyone to be moving through at midnight with lanterns. I lowered the binoculars, rubbed my eyes, and when I looked again, there were more of them. 5, 6, 7 lights drifting between the trees, spreading wider as if they were circling something I couldn't see. I reached for the radio with shaking hands. Static hissed, crackled, and then the voice returned. The same one I had heard that night on the stairs. Low, urgent, close. Don't look at them too long. That's all it said. Then silence. I froze, the words echoing in my head. Don't look at them too long. I wasn't supposed to know they were there. I wasn't supposed to see. I dropped the binoculars to my chest and stumbled back from the window. My breath caught, chest heaving, ears straining for any sound from below. But the woods remained quiet. Not a single bird, not a rustle of branches, only those lights weaving silently across the valley. I wanted to look again, to confirm what I had seen, but the warning rang louder than my curiosity. Whoever that voice belonged. And then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the lights vanished. Snuffed out, as if someone had pinched the flames between their fingers. One blink, and the forest was dark again. I stood frozen at the window, binoculars dangling useless in my hands, heart thundering. Nothing moved, nothing glowed. The valley was empty. But I knew what I had seen. I knew they had been there, and I knew they had seen me too. When I tried to radio the station again, the line was dead. Not even static this time, just silence, as though the channel itself had been cut away. I sat there until morning, lantern burning low, afraid to close my eyes. Because if the trees were moving closer by day, then by night, something else was moving with them. Something that carried lanterns. Something that didn't want to be seen. It was just after 3 a.m. when I first heard it. A faint tap, 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 like knuckles against glass. At first, I thought it was the wind pushing a branch against the window, but the tower stood alone, high above the treetops. There were no branches within reach. The knocking came again, this time harder, rhythmic, deliberate. Someone, or something, was rapping on the window just a few feet away from where I sat. I froze. My flashlight rested on the desk beside me, and I reached for it slowly, trying not to make a sound. The knocking moved from one pane of glass to another, circling the tower, as if whatever was out there was testing each window. Finally, I snapped the light on and swung it toward the sound. What I saw made my stomach drop. The reflection in the glass wasn't what it should have been. It was me, same uniform, same posture, but standing outside the tower, looking in at me with a blank expression. My own face staring back at me where no human being could possibly stand. I stumbled backward, the beam of my flashlight shaking. The reflection didn't move with me. It stayed pressed against the window, fog forming around its mouth as though it were breathing heavy against the glass. Then, without a sound, it vanished. Silence fell over the tower, but then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, heavy, descending the wooden stairs. My blood ran cold. I leaned toward the door and listened, step after step, creaking down into the dark woods below. But the thing that unsettled me most, the steps never came back up. Whatever had been at my window hadn't climbed to me. It had come from inside my tower and was leaving. The radio on my desk cracked to life so suddenly I nearly dropped the flashlight. Static hissed, then the voice, low, urgent, the same one that had warned me before. "Don't leave the tower." Then silence again. I didn't move for the rest of the night. Every muscle in my body was tense, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow, waiting for the sound to return. But it didn't, and somehow, that was worse. The hours between midnight and dawn are different here. Time doesn't pass the way it should. It stretches, lingers, like the woods themselves are holding their breath. That night, around 3 a.m, I found myself staring out into the black sea of trees, fighting to stay awake. The silence was so thick that even the hum of the radio felt too loud. And then it started. A sharp, repetitive knock, knock, knock against the glass. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe it was the creak of the tower, the wood shifting in the cold. But then it came again. 3 precise raps, just inches from where I sat. I turned my head slowly. The window pane beside me was empty, nothing but the reflection of the dim lantern light inside. Then the sound moved. Knock, knock, knock. On the opposite window, it was circling me. I grabbed my flashlight with hands that trembled despite myself. I forced a deep breath, flicked it on, and swept the beam toward the nearest window. For a split second, I saw my own reflection staring back at me in the glass. But it wasn't my reflection, not exactly. It was me, standing outside the tower. Same jacket, same tired eyes, same scars on my knuckles, but he wasn't moving in sync with me. His face was too still, too blank. His mouth moved, fogging the glass, though no sound came through. He just stood there, watching. And then, he was gone. The space outside the glass was empty, only the endless black of the forest. That's when I heard it, the groaning wood of the staircase. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, moving downward. Downward. I froze, straining to hear. The steps descended, one by one, slow, steady, until they faded into the earth below. Whatever had been inside the tower, it wasn't anymore. I thought about opening the hatch, just a crack, just to be sure I was alone. But before I could move, the radio beside me came to life. A violent burst of static cut through the silence, followed by a voice. Low, jagged, urgent. "Don't leave the tower." Then it was gone, leaving only static in its wake. My hand hovered over the mic, but I didn't dare respond, didn't dare breathe too loud, because the longer I sat there, the more I realized something terrifying. The forest wasn't silent anymore. It was listening. The minutes after that warning on the radio stretched like hours. I sat frozen in my chair, flashlight still in my grip, staring at the dark woods below. My pulse hammered in my ears, and every part of me wanted to believe I'd imagined it all. The reflection, the footsteps, the voice. But deep down, I knew better. Around 3:30, something shifted. At first, it was subtle. The stillness of the night pressed heavier than usual. No crickets, no owls, not even the faint rustle of branches. Then, I noticed it. The tree line, far out in the valley, began to sway. Not with the wind. There was no wind. The air was dead still, heavy enough that I could almost taste it. Yet the trees moved anyway. The entire forest seemed to lean, almost imperceptibly, toward the tower. It was as if the woods themselves were inhaling, drawing in a slow, massive breath that tugged at the earth. The sound came a moment later, the low creak of timber bending, thousands of trunks groaning all at once, their weight straining closer. I stood, pressing my forehead against the cold glass, watching in disbelief as the black wall of pines tilted inward, closer and closer. It was impossible, but I swear they were leaning toward me. Then came the sound, a low, guttural moan that rolled across the valley like a foghorn, only deeper, older, something vast and alive. The vibration rattled the tower itself, loosening dust from the rafters above me. My teeth ached from the force of it, and for a moment, I thought the whole structure might collapse under the pressure. And beneath that moan, voices. At first, they were tangled in the sound of straining wood, indistinct. But the longer I listened, the clearer they became. Whispered words, threading through the branches as if carried on breath. "Join us." I stumbled back from the window, the flashlight beam jerking wildly across the walls. My chest heaved, but the air was thick, unmoving, hard to drag into my lungs. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, surrounding me from every side. "Join us." The tower creaked violently, as though unseen hands were pressing against it. My book slid from the shelf, pages fluttering open like wings. Even the lantern light flickered, dimming, swelling, dimming again, like it too was breathing with the forest. I clutched the radio, desperate, thumb hovering over the transmit button. But what would I even say? Who would answer? The voices outside weren't waiting for an invitation. They were calling me by instinct, like something ancient had recognized me as its own. And as I stood in that trembling wooden box above the world, I realized the forest wasn't just alive, it wanted me. I remember the exact moment I decided I couldn't stay another night in that tower. The logbook lay open on the desk, the pages thick with my frantic handwriting, scrawled reports of moving tree lines, vanishing lights, hollow ground, the knocks on the glass. Each word felt like a confession, proof that I was either going mad or had stumbled into something I was never meant to witness. I began to pack. My hands shook as I stuffed the tapes from the recorder into my bag, along with the logbook. The typewritten rules that had been left in the drawer, I folded them once, slid them into the book's pages. If anyone ever found this place, they had to know. They had to see it wasn't just me. The radio crackled as I worked, the static hissing like a snake. Then through the static, a voice, ragged, distorted, but clear enough to freeze my blood. "If anyone hears this," I whispered into the transmitter, my throat dry, my words barely audible. "Don't take the Watchtower job. The forest is alive, and it's hungry." Silence followed. Not even the usual static, just silence, as though the radio itself was holding its breath. I left the chair turned toward the window. The glass still bore faint smudges from the night before, where someone, had knocked. My flashlight beam had shown my own reflection out there, staring back at me, waiting. I didn't dare look out again. As I slung the bag over my shoulder, the tower groaned. The whole structure shuddered, as if something massive shifted its weight against the legs. Dust trickled down from the ceiling. The wood beneath my boots trembled like a heartbeat. I didn't wait. I opened the trapdoor and descended, the ladder creaking louder than it ever had before. Each rung felt like it might snap. Halfway down, I felt a rush of cold air rising from the ground. Not the night breeze, something deeper, something that seemed to come from under the soil itself. When my boots finally hit the earth, I froze. The forest was utterly still. No wind, no insects, no sound of night creatures. The trees stood unnaturally straight, their branches stretched toward the tower, as though they had been leaning closer all along, waiting for me to come down. I didn't run. Not at first. Every instinct told me not to draw their attention, to move slowly, quietly. But the silence pressed down harder with every step I took away from the tower. And then, behind me, I heard it. One single knock on the glass, high above, from the room I had just left. I ran. Branches clawed at me as I plunged into the dark, roots rising from the earth like traps set to trip me. My flashlight beam shook wildly, catching glimpses of the carvings I'd seen before. Figures swallowed by roots, arms outstretched as if reaching for air. Each tree I passed seemed closer, thicker, as though the forest itself was close. I don't remember how long I ran. The trail disappeared, swallowed whole by the shifting tree line. My lungs burned, and every breath felt stolen. But eventually, the darkness thinned, and I stumbled into open space. A clearing, and when I turned back, the tower was gone. Where it had stood just hours before, there was only forest. Dense, unbroken, endless forest. That was the last memory I carried out of that place. After that, its fragments. Gaps. A blur of headlights when a truck driver found me wandering a back road at dawn. Questions I couldn't answer when I was brought into town, dirt-caked and rambling. People whispering, saying I must have lost my mind out there. I never went back, but years later, hikers did. They told the story like they'd discovered a ghost. Deep in those same woods, past the trails no ranger map bothered to mark, they came upon a tower. Not listed, not known, abandoned. Inside, everything lay just as it had been the night I left. The desk, the chair by the window, the radio, silent but intact. My logbook was still there, but when they opened it, they found the last entry written in a hand that wasn't mine. The words etched deep into the page, as if carved rather than written. "We moved the forest for him. We'll move it for you too." And then, the hikers stopped talking about it. Some claimed it was a prank, or a trick of old ink. Others swore they'd burned the logbook right there in the clearing. But the tower? They couldn't explain that. It wasn't supposed to exist. And yet it did. For them. For me. And maybe, one day, for you. If you're ever near an old fire lookout in West Virginia and you feel the air shift, like the entire forest is drawing breath, don't linger. Don't investigate. Leave and don't look back. The tower may look abandoned, but the woods surrounding it are not empty. They've been watching long before you arrived, and they will be watching long after you're gone. So if the trees start whispering, if the ground feels hollow, if the shadows outside the glass look too much like your own reflection, remember this story. Because the forest has patience, and the moment you hesitate, it will make room for you.